Hello and welcome to another of the tutorial summary videos. Today our topic is food and eating as cultural practices. And let's just delve right on into the learning goals. After that session, you should basically be able to understand food as an essential cultural practice. Also be able to look into how cookbooks create a culinary canon and imagine food communities. You should be able to problematize the relation between food and the nation and also be able to understand the significance of gender roles in food related practices. The following keywords should help you: kitchen politics, gastro-nationalism or food nationalism. Sorry, there's my face in front of that. The culinary turn or the so-called foodie. I will not mention the foodie as a word, but I will hopefully remember to refer to that on the respective slide. And then we have food deserts and food apartheid. Now, first topic: how are food and eating quintessential cultural practices? Well, let's have a look. Basically, if you remember that, culture is linked to the structures of feeling and lived experiences of people. So basically, how do people experience their environments? How do they make sense of their environments? And also, how do they live and make sense of that? And now, eating is, well, quite related to that because it is a basic necessity of survival. And if you think back in history, the resources you have for eating are local or regional. And that means that in a certain local community, which was the case a few hundred years back, um, practices of preparing food and eating, so basically what you eat and how you eat it, and also how you prepare the products, developed in local and cultural contexts. So they're tied to the community they come from. And the availabilities of resources and practices we have nowadays is not only tied to local and regional contexts, it's still a lot of that as well, especially in less industrialized nations. So basically, if you don't have so many economic relations, then it's very, or especially in rural areas, it's still very much tied to local products. And I mean, we also have a drive into that direction because we try to find regional products, try to buy regional in order to make food more sustainable. But in principle, the availability of resources and practices is tied to economy, also migration and mobility. So basically, migration, if people, for example, in the US, from Italy go to the Americas in the 19th or 20th century, then of course they bring their products, they bring their practices, and this is why we have pizza. Um, we also have mobility as a case. So basically, can people travel? Can people experience other cultures? Can people bring that back to their home culture? Or basically, what cultural transfer process do we have? And nowadays, we also have the academic discipline of food studies, which we can say is more or less a part of cultural studies, more or less because it overlaps, but it isn't cultural studies on the whole. But basically, food is tied to culture along those lines. I also put some examples onto that slide here. So if you think about stereotypical German or US American food, I think there's two questions we can ask. What feeds into these food types and what are related practices? So what do we have here and where does it come from? And then also what affective dimensions are linked to food. Affective in the sense of emotions, in the sense of how do we feel with that actually. Um, yeah, I basically named some examples here and would ask you to pause the video for a moment and think about where do these food types come from? Um, and where do the practices related to them come from? And also, where are they prevalent nowadays? So, how is that tied to culture? And also, how is it tied to affect? So, do people feel at home, so to say, with certain foods? Or do they experience certain foods as exotic? So, what experiences do we have with these food types? Are interesting questions that I would like you to think about. Now, one thing that is quite important in the academic area is a so-called culinary turn. And I basically gave you a quote from the introduction of a book that is basically called The Culinary Turn, and it was published 2017 in the Transcript Verlag. And basically, yeah, here you can read. I don't want to read it out. What the food turn is. Basically, we also have, if you remember that in cultural studies, a cultural turn. So a turn in society, or in that case more in the academic discipline, towards a certain aspect that then is very prominent in culture, very prominent in academia sometimes, and basically can also become a perspective of analysis. And so basically, here we say that food is something that becomes very important nowadays. And also, I think that's very important, spills over into other walks of life. So it's not only food about eating, but food is also about identity. Food is also about the nation. Food is also about gender and health and a lot of other things, also about sustainability, or as I mentioned earlier. So basically, food is linked to a lot of other aspects. And because of that, we can say that it's an area that is not only prominent and important in society, but also in academia. And this is why it's also important to study it. So now let's have a look at food and nationalism. Basically, yes, food is something essential, but of course it's tied to culture. And if it's tied to culture, it's also tied to power dynamics and a lot of other things. And one of them is the nation and nationalism, actually quite a prominent one. So if you remember that from the one section on nationalism, or where we thematized it, the nation is, so to say, an imagined community. You don't know the other people of the nation, and there are boundaries of the nation. And people nonetheless have this experience of a comradeship, of belonging somehow with regard to the nation. And now Ranta and Ishio, I hope I say the name correctly, basically say, quote, many food items and practices are so closely linked to that idea of nations that it is a challenge to find a cookbook that has no references to nations or national qualities in it, unquote. And yes, if you think about it, of course, there's a lot of cookbooks about Italian cuisine or the German cookbook or Chinese and Asian and whatever. So basically, food is very often tied to the nation. This relationship, however, is not always there and also not unproblematic. And I think that what I wrote there summarizes it quite nicely. So this relationship is contested. So what belongs to a national cuisine? What is, yeah, the food of a certain nation is also contested. It's dynamic, so it can change with people coming to the country. So for example, if you think of the US, of course that changed a lot from we have Native Americans only there and we have the natural resources to we have Europeans coming over, who just bring all their practices. We have Irish men and women, we have the people from England, we have German people, Swedish people, Italian people, we have African American people. So basically, people who originate from Africa and now come to the Americas and are okay. They actually don't come there; they are forced there. We discussed that earlier. But basically, we have a lot of people coming there, and of course, also bringing their food practices. So it's dynamic and it can be changeable. And it is, of course, mediated by actors like the state, minorities or majorities, ethnic groups. So basically, all the people and also their power dynamics. And then we have one trend that I would like to mention. I think it's important. It's so called gastro-nationalism or food nationalism. And this is, so to say, the growing trend to assert national rights to food. And there are a lot of other practices related to it, but we'll go into that in a second. First, some examples. Those are basically examples from a broad range of topics, and they are, I'm afraid, not US American, but they're basically just taken from the lecture. But if you look at them, you can see that, in a way, certain products or certain practices or certain paradigms, also in the case of this Fulcon board issue, which is tied to NS time, by the way, so be careful about that. So we have a lot of examples here that feed into the direction of we have certain foods that are protected, that are seen to be associated with certain areas, with certain nations, and then also seem to represent a part of the identity of that nations. And that is important here. So if we summarize that and put it into more theoretical and applicable terms, we can say that food nationalism has to do with national branding of foods. So, to say a trademark, what is typically German, typically US American, typically English or so? Um, Actually, English is quite interesting because if you think about typical English or British cuisine, I know this is not British cultural studies, but I think it's interesting and important. And you do have a lot of Indian dishes as well because there's a colonization history. And we have the same in the US, so we can link that actually. But colonization plays a huge role in potential national cuisines. So yeah, we have this process of standardization of a national cuisine. So basically, what belongs to it, what doesn't. We have also potential protection of agriculture, restrictions on trade of certain food items, and all that feeds into a so-called culinary canon. So basically, a representation of, well, nationalism along the terms of food. And what, of course, also plays a very big role there is power dynamics and the politics of a nation. So basically, who can say that this food is very prominent in the nation. Who can determine which food should be in that canon? Those are all questions that are linked to power dynamics and also structural inequality. And one idea that I would also like to forward is how genuine is the idea of a so called national cuisine? Is it not rather particularities pointed out as general? And especially if you look at the US, I mean, there are so many people from so many different backgrounds. And can you really say or claim that there is something national that should be the kitchen of the US, or is it rather really a lot of particularities, idiosyncrasies, and different regional kitchens as well, and different cultural kitchens, insofar as that we have a lot of migration in the US, of course. I mean, it's a white dominion, so basically, more or less, a lot of the people, the majority of the people, are not Native Americans. So this is something that I would like you to probably think about. But yeah, now let's turn to the Native Americans and how's their relationship with national cuisine. And basically, we do have this wonderful video in the lecture, or did have the wonderful video in the lecture, and I also linked it on the next slide because I took some definitions from it, where I think this is explained very much in a nutshell, and very much detail, and with much more authenticity than I can do, because it's actually Native Americans speaking about their own food systems and or their the heritage. Basically, I think that's very good. And what we can say here is that basically what we have to keep in mind here is the colonization of the Americas by the European settlers in the 18th century. Started early, took really yeah, a lot of people came in the 18th century and 19th century as well. And so basically, previously, the Native Americans were mostly local communities, so the resources and practices of food and preparation and consumption, as we mentioned in the very beginning of that session, were closely linked to the area they were coming from. And established food systems were dependent on nature. So we had basically a close connection, and people depending on the nature, but also being able to depend on that. So their whole, basically also bodies. I mean, there's this saying in German, "Du bist, was du isst." In English translation would be, "What you are eating is you." And I know this is a very bad translation. Sorry for that. But basically, your body gets used to certain nutrition, and that happened here. So basically, nature and the body and food systems all interlock. And then 18th and 19th century, colonization of the Americas and the trade of teas and the systematic displacement of the Native Americans, so a cut-off point from their food systems. And now we have the reservations where Native Americans were placed and are still placed to a great extent today. And there, the nature is completely different. We have a scarcity of resources in most cases, and the food systems, of course, collapse completely. And nowadays, we have a very big dependency, and also back then, on so-called US state commodities. So basically, we had the government systems that were like, okay, we supply the Native Americans with food, but the food that was supplied was, and I think the video explains that very much in great detail, much better than I can. They are in a way unhealthy because they don't have so many nutritions, because this is packaged food, canned food, it's not fresh food, just, a lot of vitamins are missing from it. And it is especially not considering, and that's also one reason why it's unhealthy for Native Americans, it's not considering their original diet. I was talking earlier about bodies getting used to certain foods, and exactly that's what happens here. If the body is not used to dairy products, for example, then, and that's what is said in the other video as well, about 80% of the Native Americans are lactose intolerant. So basically, dairy products, which are coming as part of these state commodities, are not really fit for those people to eat. So that is something that, we should keep in mind with regard to Native Americans and national cuisine. And then there's some keywords from the video now. One is food apartheid. It's the so-called inequality in a food system that is a result of decades of discriminatory planning and policy decisions based on race, class, and geography. So basically, exactly what happened here. We have state planning, and that results in a collapse of the Native American original food system, and now we have an absolute inequality in a certain food system with regard to how they're living now. We also have the term food desert, and that is basically neighborhoods and communities that have limited access to affordable and nutritious foods. So basically, where it's hard to get them. And that is actually, if you have the video does exactly that. It's so lovely, really. You have a map of the US where you have those food deserts, and then a map of the reservations. If you combine them, that's where the reservations are. So basically, it's just very hard to get to resources that are improving the diet. And then you have those state commodities, which are not totally helpful with regard to nutrition. Also, one thing that I found really striking with regard to that topic, basically, food, or especially healthy food alternatives, are extremely expensive in the reservations as compared to out of the reservation, which is also extremely discriminatory and forwards this so-called food apartheid. So, if we want to conclude that topic a bit, Native Americans are deprived of their own food heritage in a way because they can't have the resources. We have, I mean, few, but we do have some projects to regain those rights, to regain the own food heritage among the natives, which is very good. And also, what is important here is that the academic world starts to recognize these practices. So basically, we can say that there's hope, but it's not much. And I think the very big but here is that the national cuisine systematically excludes Native American cuisine and also food practices and everything. And then also the health and culture of Native Americans are suffering as a result of this food apartheid, the past one and also the legacy of it. So I think that's a very interesting topic, even though it's also a very, well, shocking topic, so to say. But yeah, let's turn to other topics because there is some more slides, I'm afraid. Now, gender and food. So basically, yeah, what's important here, and I might have chosen a kind of provocative title, Women in the Kitchen. I mean, well, yes. We have a lot of stereotypes and gender roles that are linked to food. And I mean, two terms are the housewife, that is, of course, associated with kitchen duties, and then the so called term of the breadwinner. So basically, that is not a term for women, it's a term for men. But also, how much are gender roles tied to food, please? Um, One example that we discussed in the lecture was the kitchen debate by Nixon and Khrushchev, and that basically is something where women are depicted as okay, yeah, women are the people in the kitchen. We want to make their life easier by having dishwashers, so it's basically forwarding the idea women are in the kitchen, and this is tied to so-called kitchen politics, which we can define as a society's norms and their enforcement and representation with regard to the questions who belongs into the kitchen and why. So basically, what stereotypes do we have there? So, for example, if you think about, and I know this is a British example once more, but we also find, I think, similarities in the Americas. But if you think about lords and servants as a system, so basically, who would belong in the kitchen? Of course, the servants and not the lords and ladies, even though there were women among the ladies, but they would not belong into the kitchen because of different kitchen politics. And one thing that is very important here is the question of how are these stereotypes and roles represented and distributed. And of course, we have advertisement and popular culture a lot, but I would also say literature and film. So every narrative where people eat. So if you have a like random children's book, really, and they get a picnic basket, for example, happens a lot in some books. Who does prepare that for them? Where do they get it? Is it the mother, the father, the aunt, the uncle? Is it a man or a woman? Do they do it themselves? So basically, food is an essential topic in a lot of narratives, in a lot of films, in a lot of areas of life, I would say. And the question of how is food prepared and who is linked to it is always very important and also very political. And one area that is especially interesting for food studies is cookbooks, and that's what we're going to look into now. So the question here would be problematizing it, because cookbooks are not just simple, okay, this is how you can prepare a certain type of food, but they actually represent food along the lines of culture. So you could say that they are producing a culinary canon by sourcing out certain recipes, grouping them, giving them a title, and we can say that they are somehow archives, that they are didactic material. They're also cultural artifacts because they conserve certain practices. They also continue them. And I would even go so far as to say that they are part of a performative network, because performativity, if you remember that from gender studies, is basically that norms are established while being performed. So if people perform in a certain way, then at some point we will see that this is what we see as a norm. And here that's the same. Cookbooks forward certain ideas and by that form the norms of yeah, food. The norms of national cuisine, edibility, also class distinction, food trends, what is valued. We also have celebrity cooks that feed into that. But we also have, so we have a mainstream, so to say, but we also have some texts that go against the grain. So cookbooks can, at one hand, of course, forward a hegemonic side on the world, or they can challenge this hegemony. And now on the next slides, I'll give you some examples. So those would be two. And I don't really want to say so much about it because I think I made it quite clear on the previous slide. So maybe you think about, okay, what is that? What kind of cookbook is that? What is it related to? And maybe also, how does it link food to nationalism, food to ethnicity, food to gender? Maybe, I mean, that's not so prominent here, but what are the links to culture of these certain cookbook titles? And I have these two as well, and these two as well. So yeah, we have certain examples here. Maybe take some time and think about it. And then that is a very tutorial related thing now. We have an application task. And of course, you can also do that on your own and as preparation for the final exam. And yeah, here's the task that I concocted. Because I think what is very interesting and what is very US America appropriate, and also something that we can use to really analyze an example and work on it and prepare ourselves, or well, you can prepare yourselves. I don't have to write the exam. You can prepare yourself well for the exam. It is also a good practice for what happens if you have to write a term paper one day or to give a presentation on something. Look into the original food systems of the Native Americans and pick one essential ingredient. Research for information on it and analyze it. Look into what I wrote there. What practices are linked to it? What kitchen politics surround it? How is it used since colonization in the Americas? And link it to food apartheid, food nationalism, history, and all what that I basically discussed in that video. And yeah, I mean, you can't present it to the group if you're doing that on your own, but basically use that as an exercise to really look into one item specifically and analyze it along the lines of what we discussed in that video. And with that, I would like to say thank you for listening and yeah, hopefully see you in the next video. If you have any questions, drop me a message. And now I have the correct email address below as well. So see you hopefully at some other point as well.